Welcome to the Peds Hub podcast. We are a group of paediatric trainees in the Southwest who every month review a selection of articles that we find useful for our practice. Please note, these are our own opinions and are produced for educational purposes only. They are not intended to substitute professional medical advice, diagnosis or treatment.
Thanks for listening. Hello, welcome to the Peds Hub podcast. My name is Felicity Cooksey and I'm a paediatric trainee in the Severn Deanery. Today I'm very pleased to welcome Dr Anna Baverstock. She is a consultant paediatrician and the Wellbeing Lead for Somerset Foundation Trust. Dr Baverstock has multiple publications on broad-ranging topics from therapeutic clowning in hospitals to specialist registrar's emotional responses to a patient's death. But most of us will know Dr Baverstock from her regular publications on kindness and civility in ADC Education and Practice with Fiona Finley. Thank you for joining me today. How are you?
Oh, I'm good, Flick. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. What a lovely introduction, thank you.
Could you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your journey to becoming a wellness lead?
Yes, so I'm a paediatrician, as you said. My specialist interest is in, community child health, and in particular, I have the privilege of looking after children with neurodisability and their families, and I still have quite a broad clinical role, although it is reducing in volume as my other role is taking over. So I am lead for Senior Doctor Wellbeing within the Trust, and I also have a role within the Wellbeing Strategy team and an increasing role, within organisational development. And what that means for people that aren't aware is around working culture, but particularly with skills in coaching, mentoring, and then more recently in facilitation and mediation. So in terms of how I got into it, so I can vividly remember it. It was 21 years ago. Goodness, I'm getting old. I was a paediatric registrar running a really busy service in Bath. It was a night. I had the general peds bleep, I had the neonatal bleep, and I was pregnant. And I had a really, really bad run of on-calls, culminating in a unexpected patient death at 4 a.m. And I was exhausted and I was clearly very emotional, and I was walking along the corridor and I bumped into Fiona Finley, my then educational supervisor, who'd brought in an elderly neighbour, and we sat and we reflected about how hard it was being a paediatric registrar and being a paediatric consultant as she was, and that we didn't really talk about it. So we sort of made a bit of a plan then to talk about it a little bit more. And I could not be more grateful to Fiona, who is now clearly a long-time collaborator and a really good friend of mine, because she took this very emotional paediatric registrar and said it was okay, it was absolutely usual to feel like this, and perhaps we could do some research and start to find out about how other people felt, and sparked a research interest that I didn't think I had, but also, I guess, a real passion for trying to change the system and trying to change how we were talking about it. The sad thing is, I read the first paper we wrote sometimes and think, gosh, have we changed anything? But then when I'm more positive, I think, well, perhaps what we have changed is talking about it. We haven't necessarily got the solutions right, but we are certainly talking about the emotional impact of the work that we do so much more.
Oh, well, I think you've changed culture here. We're discussing 2 articles today.
Yep.
One was written by yourself, titled Kindness in Working Culture. It was published in the September British Association of Community Child Health newsletter. The other is a systematic review titled The Impact of Unacceptable Behaviour Between Healthcare Workers on Clinical Performance and Patient Outcomes, which was published in the September edition of BMJ Quality and Safety. Links to these articles can be found in the episode description. So starting with your article, Kindness in Working Culture, I found it really thought-provoking, and it was written so clearly. It focuses on kindness and inclusion in working culture. We've all heard of the golden rule, treat others how you wish to be treated, but you discussed the platinum rule. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that I'm still very much learning, particularly the language around inclusion. We know that we really need to embrace diversity. We know that in order to embrace diversity, to enable people to have equity and equality, we need to enable inclusion and to enable us all to get to a sense of belonging. But I think we still have quite a long way to go to have brave, inclusive conversations that enable that. And I was taught growing up the golden rule. So the golden rule is to treat others how you would wish to be treated. And upon my reading, I came across the platinum rule, which is to treat others how they wish to be treated. And the only way that we know that is by creating an environment that's safe enough or brave enough such that we can ask them to find out. And a way sometimes people describe it is, if I'm making a hot drink, I don't make everyone a cup of really strong builder's tea. I go around the room and I ask. And it's a little bit like that in terms of our working culture. But I think there's probably a caveat that I have learnt even since September. We talk a lot about creating safe spaces at work, and actually I think it's really hard to create a working culture space where everyone feels safe, because we don't know everyone's unique needs. So actually, can we create brave spaces where we're really trying to create a space that's psychologically safe, but we recognise that there's no one size fits all, and so we have to acknowledge that and be aware of that. It's one of those things, the more I read and learn around inclusion, the more I realise that I am really at the start of thinking about this. It's why it's not been solved to date. It's why we're still having those conversations. But I think the more that we can have those conversations and create those brave spaces, the more that we potentially have to gain, particularly now as a working culture within the NHS.
Yeah, and you also talk about empathy, and your definition of empathy was a little bit different.
So perhaps it's the geeky bit of me that I love the fact that at the ripe old age of 51, I am still relearning some of the very basic definitions that I thought I'd got nailed at medical school many years ago. So empathy is a real classic example, isn't it? Because we talk about walking each other's shoes, and then we get really earnest and we talk about taking your shoes off first before you can then put someone else's shoes on. But the reality is that if I take off my boots, put on your shoes and walk a mile, I'm a mile away from you and I've nicked your shoes, and I'm no closer to finding out how it is for you.
Yeah.
So Brené Brown, who you will know I'm a massive fan of, in her most recent book, Atlas of the Heart, just blew me away when she said that rather than walking in your shoes, I need to learn how to listen to the story you tell about what it's like in your shoes. And here's the absolute bit, and believe you even when it doesn't match my experiences. And that, I pulled up short at that because I thought, goodness me, how many times have I sat there and listened to a story, and because through my lens of privilege or my lens of expectation, couldn't quite get to grips with what I'm hearing. And I therefore dismissed, deflected or defended something, rather than sit there and think, wow, that's such a different version. I need to lean into that and think about why I'm finding that really hard. I find it really helpful. It's incredibly challenging because I guess it adds some uncertainty to it. And sometimes it's about sitting and reflecting and listening and learning even more to be able to then think about what it is that's getting in the way of you understanding something. And that for me feels more like a definition that I can kind of work with, but it doesn't make it easier.
Brené Brown's work is incredible. I started with her Netflix documentary as a starting point and I was blown away. She's such a good speaker.
She's great, and what I think, having, I guess, followed her work over the last 20 years probably, is I love the fact that she is brave enough to challenge her own previous thoughts and to come up with definitions. So empathy is something in particular that she has changed how she has thought about it. And I really admire the fact that her books are a work in progress. And I think when I first started writing a little bit, I was really worried about putting down something that I might change my mind about. I'm now not worried about that because it's all part of the learning. So that it's, when you finish writing something, it is as good as you can get it at that time, and you have to accept that a year on or 2 years on you might have formed thoughts in a new way and hopefully an enhanced way.
Yeah. And later in the article you discuss enabling inclusion, and a key step to that is addressing and thinking about our own unconscious biases.
Yes.
How do you think we as individuals can go about that?
Yeah, so fascinating conversations with Harriet Jones, our head of inclusion here at Somerset Foundation Trust, who I have to say I have been really fortunate to have regular conversations with, because we quickly realised that my conversations around kindness and civility and her conversations around how we enable authentic inclusion, which goes beyond more tokenistic events to more embedding it, were very overlapping in both their aims, but also in some of the behaviours that we were needing to address to achieve it. So when you talk about unconscious biases, there is a real mixed evidence around unconscious bias training, which is really unfathomable unless you spend some time unpicking it. So if you send colleagues who aren't terribly invested on unconscious bias training, you don't particularly make any difference around their biases, and in actual fact you may make things worse.
Oh, right.
But actually, if you talk about unconscious bias in a more authentic way, which is we all have unconscious bias, we all have a bias because of the way that we're brought up, because of our culture, our values, our wider, all the things that make us uniquely us. Within that, there will be some bias that comes. The important thing for me is it's one of those things that once you begin to realise it and once you begin to learn it, you then spot more and more. But it's quite painful. You have those wince, I call them wince moments. In fact, I got the word from John Amici, whose work I read as well. You have those moments you think, oh, I can't believe I thought that, or I'm really interested that my assumption was. And you then have to be kind to yourself, and so I have now learnt from that. We have a natural tendency to not want to do difficult things, and so sometimes I think we avoid having those really important, what is described as innovism, so those internal conversations where we actually recognise that we do have biases. We are very, very capable of displaying those biases in unwanted ways, and we're a work in progress. And I think if we can start to have conversations within that framework, I think we have much better ability to start changing culture in an authentic way.
Yeah, I recently completed an ethics course.
Yes.
I hadn't expected there to be such a large focus on unconscious bias. It's the idea that you can't make an ethical decision unless you strip back your privilege, how you were raised, your parents' views, and actually then be able to make a decision. And there were two terms I came across which I found interesting, and they were moral myopia and moral muteness.
Wow.
Are they terms you use?
No, tell me more. They're fascinating. So I can guess, but perhaps I oughtn't to guess a definition, but I love them. So do you want to tell me a bit about moral myopia?
Yeah, so the definitions are from the Ethics Unwrapped resource from Texas University, which I'd really recommend. They've got lots of videos on unconscious bias and ethical terms. And so they say moral myopia is the inability to see ethical issues clearly.
Yeah.
Whereas moral muteness is when we see unethical behaviour but we choose to stay quiet and not challenge it because we're concerned often about creating conflict and the social or emotional cost of speaking up. Is that something you have experience of or come across?
So I love the fact that I'm learning new words. So yes, absolutely. How I have thought about moral muteness is that reflects our privilege. So it is because we are privileged that we are able to be morally mute and walk past things, that because we have a choice in terms of, do I intervene and say something or do I not? We're recently doing some allyship and leadership training in the Trust, and I guess my way of encouraging colleagues to do the innovism and do the work around listening, around the unlearning and relearning and taking action that Reid talks about in her book The Good Ally, is that the more you do that, the more it becomes easier to say something. I guess you unmute yourself using your language. The more it becomes easier to say something, because you know that either way you have very much recognised it, and walking away is as challenging as saying something. There's a human tendency to want to avoid difficult conversations. Can we get to the tipping point where avoiding the difficult conversation has as emotional impact on you as having the difficult conversation? Now, I freely admit, whilst on the very good day I am very much at that tipping point of wanting to intervene and wanting to say something, I am also really capable of taking a really deep breath and thinking, oh gosh, it's hard. I guess what I would share is I don't think it gets any easier, but what I would suggest is the motivation makes you a bit braver. And the fact that I know that if I don't have the conversation, I ruminate and think about it so much more than whatever rumination I might have over the conversation. But that moral muteness, which is lovely, I love that word, very much comes from privilege, because it's the fact that you have that choice.
Yeah, and for people wanting to know where to start or to look into more resources, where would you recommend people start?
So I guess it depends at the stage that you're at. So I really am a big believer that you have to be authentic in this process, and you also have to be kind to yourself. So you start at the point of where you are in terms of your learning. What I would also caution everyone is that wherever they think they are, as soon as they start reading, if they're truly interested and they're truly reading, they will suddenly realise that there is a whole huge bit of evidence and a whole bit of information, because of wherever your starting point, there is so much more to this than you think there is going to be. So you have that sort of naive enthusiasm that I probably had to start with, that you just needed to do some reading and then you would then be able to educate yourself. I am still reading a year on and I still have only scratched the surface. And I also found it really hard in terms of just sitting and identifying some of that privilege and that uncomfortableness that I hadn't previously thought of, and having to process that in a way that felt kind of authentic, and it takes time. So I would absolutely suggest reading, and I think we can put some resources in the show notes. You need to do the innovism and the inner work before you can then be an activist, from whatever activist you want to be. And I clearly come at it from a very relational perspective. I really believe that we change culture one conversation at a time, and that we do that together. If you're interested in how to start having those conversations, then there's, I guess, a few approaches, which obviously I refer to in the article. So if you subscribe to Batch News, you will also get the follow-up article very soon. So radical candour is a concept that Kim Scott talks about in her work. So she talks about having a conversation with high challenge and high support. And I'm very visual, so I very much keep her framework, which is a very visual framework, in mind. And then I think that Jerry Hickson's work at Vanderbilt University around cup of coffee conversations, which is again about calling it out with kindness, or calling it in with kindness. So it's about trying to have those conversations in a way where you're being very clear about the behaviour that was witnessed and was really challenging, but you're wanting to make sure that you're addressing it in a kind way. And he also introduces the concept of an active bystander. So for example, Flick, if I was really rude to you and you didn't feel able to have that conversation with me, you might then go away and have a conversation with one of my colleagues, and they've got two aims. The two aims are to check that I'm okay and to convey the behaviour. So they might then say to me, Anna, I don't know if you remember a conversation that you recently had with Flick, and I just want to give you some feedback about that. But before I do that, I just want to check that you're okay. And I just want to let you know that following that conversation that you had with Flick, she was left feeling really upset. And here's the magic bit, and I know that you would want to know. Now, 95% of the time, I'm going to say, do you know what, I was really grumpy. I'm going to go away and apologise to Flick. Thank you very much for letting me know. The advantage is I'm then coming to you saying I'm sorry, rather than you needing to come to me saying how you spoke to me just then wasn't right.
Yeah.
So it immediately changes the dynamic. Now, sure, the bystander sometimes gets a deflection, a dismissal, or, you know, if I'm particularly grumpy, well, I just haven't got time for this. Your role's not to judge or solve, your role is to purely give the information. Even when I've had really challenging cup of coffee conversations with my colleagues where I have been left thinking, I don't know what's going to happen, there has usually been some behaviour change. And the evidence from the Vanderbilt work is huge, that they've had thousands of cup of coffee conversations. They've only needed to have a few repeat cup of coffee conversations. The important thing about all of this is we're layering up. So it's information, it's cup of coffee conversations, it's then perhaps braver conversations. But then at the top of that, if we're really going to start addressing these behaviours within our systems, we need to then also have resolution or conflict coaching and mediation, and have the even braver conversations that sit on the top for when the initial conversations haven't worked. And that's the bit that I'm really clear about doing the work within the trust, is that we need to make sure that if we start a process and we're not resolving it, we need to then put in place support in order to resolve it. Otherwise, we risk not supporting colleagues who are having the brave conversations lower down to be able to then affect the behaviour change that we're wanting to see.
Yeah, and I think that brings us on nicely to think about what the evidence is behind challenging this unacceptable behaviour. Yeah. Many of us will have heard of the Civility Saves Lives campaign, and we're going to be discussing a systematic review which was on the impact of unacceptable behaviour between healthcare workers on clinical performance and patient outcomes. So in this study, the authors aim to review the evidence of the effect of unacceptable behaviour between healthcare colleagues on the team and the impact on patient care. They intentionally didn't use the term incivility because they were concerned that the term has problematic connotations, and they chose to use the term unacceptable behaviour to try to capture a broad range of behaviours. And they said that was where the intent might not have been to cause harm, as well as behaviours that were infrequent, so not bullying or something that was repetitive. They did a systematic review, which resulted in 36 studies being concluded, and they looked at clinical performance, quality of care, workplace productivity, and patient outcomes. I just wondered, after reading the study, which parts struck you most?
So when I first saw the study, I thought, fantastic. Because actually, you know, the very fact that there is a volume of evidence that enables a systematic review around this, I think is really positive. I guess I'm an incredibly positive person, so reading this through my very positive bias, because I think we need to accept that you know, in their conclusion, they talk about the fact that the overall weight of the evidence shows that unacceptable behaviour negatively affects the clinical performance of healthcare workers, quality of care, workplace productivity and patient outcomes. So there's clearly some caveats within that. The usual, start off with lots of studies, end up with a small amount of studies, and only a very few of them were sim-based randomised controlled trials. I guess for paediatricians, I would point them in the direction of Riskin's work. Riskin's done some work around neonatal sims where the results I think are pretty interesting and striking around the impact of rudeness on communication, performance and ultimately patient care and patient safety. And obviously this was one of the studies they included. I think the other study that I go to as part of this is also the study within theatres. Again, sim scenario within theatres with anaesthetists and surgeons that perhaps we can talk about in a moment as well. But I guess the kind of message to deliver to the paediatricians who may be listening is that I think this is still an area that, if you're interested in sim, is a potentially really important area to research. And I think sim scenarios give us the way of practicing how we manage behaviour, but also studying the impact of behaviour. And I think that their conclusion was that future research should focus on the evaluation and implementation of interventions that reduce the frequency of these behaviours. And so I guess what I take from this is there's probably enough evidence to say that how we behave with each other starts to have an impact. The $1 million question is, what can we do about it? So we did do a study locally in maternity, which we have published in the Midwifery Journal, where we did start to look at a series of civility workshops over time involving the whole maternity team. We were able to start reducing the amount of incivility. If you just do it for a short period of time, you actually see incivility go up because what you're doing is raising awareness. So you don't worry about the initial upsurge because what you need is the longer term data, which then shows you that it goes down. But it was a small study. It was done over a time period. And I think if I'm really honest, I think that behaviour change relies initially on having a few local enthusiasts. It's how we maintain it and sustain it when the enthusiasts either move on to different roles or perhaps move on, and that's the bit that I don't think we've got really good evidence on. So for me it was a call to arms for more research about a really important area that I think a lot of people are realising is the key part of what impacts on our wellbeing on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, because the results which struck me most were those that impacted on patient care.
Yeah.
Because there was one study that reported that there was more than a 10% increase in post-operative complications in cases where surgeons displayed unacceptable behaviour which had been identified by colleagues.
Yeah.
Which I think was the study that you were...
Yeah, so there's, I guess if you're interested in kindness and compassion and patient outcomes, which I guess is the flip of what we're talking about, then there's a phenomenal book published called Compassionomics, which talks about the implications of compassionate care and the implications of care that is less compassionate in a brilliant way. So it's like a systematic review in a book by Stephen Trizek and another colleague. But the study that I quite like to quote from the civility point of view, and it is a little bit stereotypical, I own that when I quote it, is a sim scenario where there is a rude surgeon and a polite surgeon working with an anaesthetist. And I always say that it could very easily be the other way around. But what they did was really, really clever. So the anaesthetist was able to identify when they were working with the rude or the polite surgeon. But what they weren't able to do was have insight into the impact that had on their performance. So when they were measured procedurally, their procedural performance was lower when they were working with the rude surgeon than with the polite surgeon. But they felt that they were able to counteract the rude behaviour and it didn't have an impact on their performance. So that for me was a real light bulb moment in terms of we are impacted when we're working with rude colleagues, and we perhaps overestimate our ability to overcome that rudeness. And I hear that a lot. It would be really interesting to look at that aspect in terms of our insight into the impact that the behaviour has.
Yeah, they included some qualitative studies which explored the potential mechanisms of negative outcomes, and they discussed people having increased anxiety, becoming avoidant, being less helpful. I think from personal experience I could relate to that. If someone's rude to me, I think, oh, I'm going to internalise and go inside my shell a little bit.
So absolutely, it is a confronting thing when someone is rude, particularly when someone is unexpectedly rude, because we're not expecting it. So it interrupts our cognitive flow. So we divert some energy to managing the rudeness, worrying about the rudeness, trying to justify the rudeness, thinking, was it me, rather than being able to stick to the task in hand. So it is an absolute example of, it's not just multitasking, it's task switching, isn't it? We switch on to ruminating about the rudeness. I think also we perhaps don't share how long that effect is. So if I have had a conversation with a colleague where they have been rude to me, whilst I try and get over it in the real time to be able to try and get on with whatever I'm doing, it has a really annoying habit of sitting there on my shoulder and reminding me through the day. You sort of think back around that conversation and replay it in your mind, don't you? And I think the impact on that is huge. And that's the bit that I think, if we can have the conversation at the time, or if we can have the cup of coffee conversation, it ends up being really helpful for the person on the receiving end of the rudeness, because they can then close that loop.
I think so, and I think it probably does affect longer term relationships if that behaviour hasn't been challenged at the time.
Yes, so obviously now with my mediation hat on, and I have to stress this is an incredibly new skill that I have learnt. Yes, I am a qualified mediator, but I still think of myself as a bit of very much a newbie. But what I really learnt from the most phenomenal training that I think I've ever received, which was 6 days of intensive role play and conversations around conflict and challenge, was that often the initial conversation where the relationship started to break down can't actually be remembered 2 or 3 years on. But what is remembered is the ongoing emotional impact that then has on both people. And if we don't have the conversation where we clarify it, we make up our own story.
Yeah.
But we don't in our heads think of it as a made-up story. It then becomes a real story. So again, if we can just start using that in our language. So when you said that to me, the story I made up in my head was that you thought I was this, that and the other. Actually, that's the reality of it. I've used that a couple of times to really good effect, because of course I'm effectively declaring the story I've made up in my head. And so my colleague has come back and said, well, that's really interesting that's the story you made up. The story that was going on in my head was this, that and the other. And then we can then, meet somewhere. So when we talked about language, you clearly like language as well. I think we really need to think about sometimes the language that we use when we're having a challenging situation. And if we can take a deep breath and pause and acknowledge that we're feeling emotional, but really try and communicate some of the reasons behind it, but also do it in an authentic but quite a tentative way, which is why I really like what I'm making up in my head, or what I think I'm hearing, or what I think I'm seeing, because then we can connect together in a more human way, rather than what often happens is that we're under pressure, so we retreat and we become defensive or dismissive, and we react in ways that perhaps aren't very helpful.
Yeah. Now, this systematic review does obviously have limitations, as we've discussed.
Absolutely.
So many of the results from the studies are subjective in nature. They're based on self-reported surveys. The randomised control trials were sim-based, and the authors here have therefore questioned if it is applicable in the real world and about the concerns of bias. But I think I know the answer to this already. But overall, do you think there is enough evidence to persuade individuals and listeners that we should all be looking at our own practices and trying to make changes to reduce unacceptable behaviour in the workplace?
So yes, you were expecting that. What I would also point to, so the Civility Saves Lives website has been recently revamped. It's got quite a lot of the evidence that's in the systematic review on there, and I think it is a really helpful source of just the wide impact of rude behaviour, but also sustained rude behaviour within a hierarchy that's potentially undermining or bullying. I also think, I guess I'm quite a practical person, this is something that I feel we can change. This is a human part of us that we can change. There is so much evidence around kindness and compassion as well, the other way round, that I really do think this is win-win. But I'm not underestimating the challenge. We're tired, we're under pressure, and tired and under pressure. Are you hungry, angry, late, lonely, tired? The Holt posters. All of those things are not conducive to kind, compassionate, civil conversations. So we also have to recognise that a workforce under pressure, we're going to potentially see more of this. So I guess how I see that is, when I hear and see this behaviour, my feeling is always, how are the colleagues that are affected by it? Both sides of the conversation.
So I sometimes wonder about, in terms of addressing things systematically, if a huge impact is actually staffing levels. If we don't have the additional capacity to have compassion, to have patience, to teach when we're feeling more under pressure and are stressed or having challenging conversations.
Yeah, and I think we don't verbalise just how precious the NHS workforce is, particularly at the moment. and how, we all have a role, we all have a part to play to try and think about how we can improve that individually, within teams and organisationally. And clearly, depending on your role, you have more or less influence on what you can do. So we can all potentially look at how we do things individually. I would really hope that in the majority of our teams we all have an influence on our teams, because I think that hopefully within many of our teams we do have an inclusive environment, and I certainly know that many of our best team interventions have been very much doctor in training led. And then obviously those of us who have roles in leadership also then have a responsibility to think about organisation wide and system change as well.
Yeah. And if there's somebody listening at the moment and they're having a difficult time because they're experiencing rude behaviour from colleagues, and if it's sustained, what would be your top tips? What should they do in that situation?
So that's a great question. So my first bit of advice would be to find someone to talk to. So if you are a paediatric doctor in training, can you speak to a fellow paediatric doctor in training? Can you speak to an educational supervisor, a clinical supervisor, a senior doctor who you work with, or a senior nurse that you work with, or someone else within the trust who you feel that you can speak to? Do you have within your education faculty an associate director of medical education with a role around trainee support, or a pastoral tutor? And if you really feel that you don't have anyone within that training environment that you can talk to, then every hospital trust has a freedom to speak up guardian, where you can have a conversation in confidence about the situation, and their roles are very much to support you as an individual, but also potentially support you in terms of what needs to happen. And I think if you're facing that, particularly as a doctor in training, the two things to remember are that as a trust we should be supporting you, and as a trust we should be also, in terms of you personally, and then as a trust we should also be supporting you with addressing the behaviour, and the two are different. So at the very least we need to be supporting you to make sure that you're all right, and then alongside that it would be then how do we address that.
Great, thank you for that. And my final question, a little bit different. I know that you're an avid reader, and I was just interested to know what your favourite book is.
My favourite book, so I do read a lot. I guess within the context of this, I guess that probably one of the most influential books that I've read recently, that took a long time to read, and those of you who know me know that I skim read really, really quickly. My father was a journalist and he taught me a phenomenal life skill early on, which was how to read a book very quickly. But I found myself reading this book really slowly and deliberately, and it's called The Good Ally by Reid, and she frames allyship around listening, unlearning, relearning, and then taking action or activism. And I just found the authenticity with which she wrote the book, but also the really powerful chapters and examples really, really helpfully. I also really like what I call a magic carpet ride, so a book that I can just escape with. And I recently read a book called The Keeper of Stories. Without any spoilers, it's a story around a lady who has various different stories that she hears and she keeps. And it really resonated for me, because we often talk about storytelling in medicine and in paediatrics, and I think of myself sometimes as a storyteller, but actually it made me reflect that actually perhaps we are better story keepers, because we hear a lot of stories. Many of those stories we don't tell because we keep them and we hold them, and I love that concept.
Oh, lovely. I've just looked it up. So The Keeper of Stories is by Sally Page.
Sally Page, thank you. Yeah, I love that book. That was something that I read recently.
Oh, well, thank you so much for joining me today. I hope everyone listening enjoyed this episode. You can follow Dr Anna Baverstock on Twitter, and please let us know your feedback. Thank you.
That's all for this episode. As always, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to get in touch via our email address podcast@peedshub.co.uk or via the PeedsHub website. Equally, if you'd like to get involved, we always welcome your voices, so please do get in touch. Thanks for listening.